So, I really do believe that if we kind of say, all right, we all have these demands in our lives. Everybody's a firefighter. You kind of look at the job. We all have these other unique hobbies, interests that we have outside of work. If we're looking at different pieces of information that kind of puts us all on the same playing field that we can gather from an assessment, I really think that one thing that kind of pulls us all together is mobility. Because we all need mobility to move. And so if we think about our activity, just our activities of daily living, if I don't have hip mobility, if I don't have shoulder mobility, so I can't look over my head, that's going to influence absolutely everything I have to do. And if we talk about fitness being important and how we move being important, if we don't have the mobility, then it doesn't matter how fit we are, how aware we are, we just can't actually physically perform certain tasks. We can't put ourselves in particular positions. And so if we look across the board, regardless of the firefighter that we're working with, regardless of their age, regardless of their interest, regardless of how fit they are, we all need mobility. And so I would suggest that if we're looking to say, where do we start from this informal perspective, we start there. Because if we're trying to get a sense of how someone moves in various contexts, it could be that their mobility is influencing them, or their lack of mobility is influencing them. And if we don't have an appreciation for their lack of mobility or the presence of mobility, we can start inferring certain things or making assumptions about what their needs are when they're actually this. And so what I'm going to propose to you guys is that because we all do this, there are things that we can start with. Okay, so if we go back to beyond being a firefighter, everybody does this stuff. And so there are certain levels of mobility that we all need just to function on a daily basis. Okay, would everybody agree? We all do this stuff? Okay, so we need ankle mobility, we need hip mobility, we need shoulder mobility, just to perform our activities of daily living. And if we don't have that stuff, it's going to influence how we perform, our quality of life, and everything that we can pile on top of it's going to suffer. So as a first step, let's try and get a sense of what that looks like. And then we can kind of pile on from there. But I really do believe that we should be starting with the mobility piece, and this is something, again, our firefighters can do wherever they are. All right, so just to give you guys a couple little glimpses of why this can matter, so we did some work with some firefighters, and we found that there were one lifting. Firefighter, I don't know if you guys can see it, firefighter was lifting up a box, and his heel kept coming off the ground. And it came to that the firefighter's ankle was actually fused. And so he doesn't have ankle dorsiflexion range of motion. And so then our question was, okay, this is a very interesting case study. How would limited ankle mobility, so exactly like this guy has, how might that influence his whole movement pattern up the chain? Okay, so could lack of ankle mobility influence how a firefighter lifts? We often think, somebody lifts and they're rounding their back, and so it's like, you got tight hamstrings. It's like, maybe it has nothing to do with your hamstrings. Maybe it's got everything to do with your ankle. And so we actually did a project where we had people come in, and this is probably hard for you guys to see, but we actually locked everybody's ankle. Okay, so they came in, they performed a series of lifts. In one condition, we locked their ankle. Then we had them repeat the task with no ankle constraint. So they had, access to all range of motion they had. And what we found is you round your back way more when lifting. If I have to get this job done, if I gotta get down to the ground, you round your back way more if your ankle is jacked up. Okay, so it might have nothing to do with your hamstring and everything to do with your ankle. But if we don't realize that, if we don't know how everything is kind of connected through the chain, and then your ankle mobility can influence what you're doing with your back, we might say, hey, you need to go stretch your hamstrings. When they got lots of hip range, their hamstrings are really flexible. Right? The solution for them, the intervention they need, is you got to get more ankle mobility. Or if you can't get ankle mobility like this individual, we need to find a different strategy. So if you're lifting, if you go wider with your feet, that's going to allow you to get deeper without requiring the same ankle range of motion. But stretching your hamstrings has nothing to do with it. Okay, so again, I think that we need to start thinking differently about the role that mobility has, and it's not just the adjacent joint that could be limiting things. That's just one example. Here's another example, and so you guys can imagine, this wasn't with firefighters, and this wasn't our work, But you can imagine about getting in and out of a truck. And so what this study showed is just kind of stepping off the step here. If I'm tasked with dropping my foot down and actually contacting the ground, and I have limited ankle dorsiflexion, what are the potential consequences? If I have to get the job done, I have to step out of the truck, I got to get down to the ground. What they found is those individuals with limited ankle dorsiflexion were forced to drop their knee in. Okay, so I don't have ankle dorsiflexion, I got to get the range somewhere. So I'm going to drop my knee down so I can actually get down to the ground. Okay, so if you have a firefighter, again, that has limited ankle dorsiflexion, and they're forced to complete a task, they're going to find a solution to do it. And we just don't want that solution to have to be to drop your knee in. Because we know, key features, that that's going to be bad for their knees. So again, just to highlight that the mobility that we have is going to influence how we perform all these activities of daily living, things that we perform every day. But being aware of that relationship is going to be really valuable for us as PFTs. Because it then says what information we should we be collecting from an assessment to guide the decisions that I'm then making. So no, I don't want to stretch my hamstring. I got to work on the ankle mobility. Okay, so that's kind of where we're going to go. So then the question becomes, well, how should we assess? So if I tasked you guys to say, all right, how do we assess somebody's mobility? Where would you guys go first? Any thoughts about what you do or even what we've done this morning? Where would we start or where could we start?
Just doing an air squat could tell you a lot.
Okay, I love it. Just doing an air squat. Okay, so now we're using something like a movement screen to get a sense of someone's mobility. So me doing an air squat. So say I'm in here, I'm doing an air squat. What types of mobility do I need to perform that task?
Hips, ankles,
Okay,
knees.
hips, ankles. So if I don't have that mobility, I'm not going to be able to do that. So you could watch me move in something like this and get an interesting sense of what type of mobility I have. So if this is my squat, and this is my air squat, what would you guys say about my mobility?
It's limited.
Okay, we make the assumption that it's limited. Maybe it's not. Maybe I just don't know. Maybe I have no awareness of how I'm moving. I got lots of range. I'm just not using the range I have. Okay, so we can use, something that we did this morning, so we used the range of motion test. We were reaching with the shoulder, up the back, down the back, doing a straight leg raise. Those were active tests. You guys know if I said the difference between active and passive? You guys heard those terms before? Okay, active meaning that I'm actively using my muscles to take myself through a range. Passive meaning
Someone's
I'm
doing
not
it
using
for
my
you,
muscles.
basically.
Something else is taking me through. Whether that's gravity, whether it's another person, whether I got a band wrapped around my foot, that's taking me through the range. So my muscles can shut off, so I don't have to worry about actively going through the range. Okay? So if we take the test you guys did this morning, the active straight leg raise, and we contrast that to a passive straight leg raise, would you guys assume that you're going to get this kind of a similar answer between both? Maybe. Okay, so here we got a passive straight leg raise. So this is me. I'm taking Luke through a range of motion here. Okay, so what changes if I let go and have Luke go through actively? What's the difference between the tests?
One's using muscles.
One's using muscles. Okay, so if Luke can't use his muscles for some reason, maybe he's not strong enough, maybe he doesn't know how to coordinate his muscles, he may not be able to get himself through the same range. So when I'm assessing Luke passively, his muscles don't have to work. There's no coordination, there's no strength involved, and so essentially it's telling me what type of mobility or range of motion he has in that joint. Okay, I can actually see, yep, this is the range you actually have in that joint. The second I go active, now it could be part of the range I have in that joint, but it could also be strength and coordination and how aware Luke is with the task. Okay, so if we use an active test, it will provide some insight into mobility, but it can be limited because it's also influenced by other stuff. So if I truly want to get a sense of someone's mobility, if they have a restriction, I need to test them passively. Because actively, there's other stuff going on. Okay, so active muscles, the second my muscles are involved, things can change. Just as you guys saw me do an air squat up here. Okay, so I might have lots of range in my hips, but I still squat like this. So I'm not using the range of motion I actually have, because I don't know how to. So if Luke's picking up his leg here, so we did active range of motion, and we're actually lifting that leg up, changes everything. But what I would say is if I have active mobility, so if you see me do this straight leg raise, and I can get up all the way, you now know I have at least that much passively. Okay, so if I'm showing you actively, I have this range of motion. You know, at minimum, I have the same passively. But if I start passively, so Luke brings me all the way up to here, and he's like, now try this on your own, and I get to that. Because I'm not strong enough to get my leg up all the way. So if we start actively, and we get to a certain point, yeah, I know passively you're good. But if I start passively, I still have to test you actively to see if you can use it. So again, if we take it back to the squat, so I can use a squat. If I drop down, rock bottom, all the way down, back straight, knees are good, you can say you got the range. You have hip mobility, you have ankle mobility. And I know you have it passively. But if I tested you passively and say you've got lots of range, and then you see me squat like this, it's like, you're not using the range that you have. Is that okay? So if you have it actively, you have it passively. But you have it passively, I still don't know. I gotta look to see if you're actually using it. Okay. So this ties back to the movement screening piece. So we can use movement to actually assess mobility if viewing it through the right lens. So we got, I don't know, can you guys all see this? Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. So we got two people here. This individual on the left doing an overhead squat. So what could you guys tell me about his mobility at the moment? Let's look at ankle, hip, and shoulder.
Shoulders are forward.
Okay, shoulders are forward. So right away, we have this kind of idea of what we want an overhead squat to look like. And so I would agree. So we're seeing hands are forward, or shoulders are forwards. And if we have some type of reference, so if we say in relation to the toe, hands are in front of the toe. Okay, everybody sees that?
Yes.
All right, I like that. What else do we see?
The knees are not beyond the toe.
Okay, it's another one. So we're looking at the relationship of where the knee is in relation to the toe. That's going to be an indicator of dorsiflexion. So the farther forward my knees go, the more dorsiflexion I need, provided that my heels stay on the ground. Okay, so if this is the same individual, if the knees were here, that angle between the shin and the floor would be greater. So they're going through more dorsiflexion range of motion. So the farther the knee, the more dorsiflexion. What else do we see?
Heels aren't flush on the floor.
Okay, I like it. So we see the heel's not quite flush on the floor. So perhaps compensating a little bit, shifting the weight forwards, because there's a lack of dorsiflexion. Perhaps. Okay, I like that. What else?
Hips.
Hips. So what do we see with the hips?
The hips on the left are parallel above the knee and tell them they're below on the right.
Okay, awesome. So just the depth of the squat. So if I'm looking kind of parallel, if I want to get to parallel here with the thigh, this guy's a little higher, especially than this guy over here. So the depth of the squat is going to give me some indication of hip mobility. So knees forwards, a little bit of ankle, depth, a little bit of hip, hands forwards, a little bit of shoulder. Everybody agree? Okay, so there may be some things in this one that we're like, I don't necessarily like that. Now my question for you guys would be, can we say that this individual lacks ankle, hip, or shoulder mobility?
Yes.
No,
Maybe
not
they just don't know
specifically.
Maybe they don't know how to do this.
Maybe they don't know how to do it.
He's also looking down. So
He's also looking down.
Looking to the floor.
Okay, so what we can say is maybe he lacks ankle, hip, and shoulder, but I don't know because this is an active test. Actively, he's not using the range, but I don't know if it's an issue that he just doesn't have it or he's not using it for a variety of reasons. Okay, so I can't look at this guy and say with any certainty that he needs to work on dorsiflexion or hip flexion or shoulder flexion mobility. But I look at this guy, his hands are back, he's below parallel, his knees are beyond his toes. I look at this guy and I can say, you don't have an issue. Because he's actually showing me that actively he can get into that position. He can use hip range of motion. He can use the ankle dorsiflexion. He can use shoulder flexion. So if he's showing us that he has mobility actively, we know he has it passively. This individual is showing us he doesn't have it actively. I don't know if he does passively. Does that make sense? Right. So, when we're looking at mobility, and we kind of talked about this already, I don't know if anybody's ever seen this before, but our body is a series of joints, and every kind of successive joint either requires mobility or stability or control. So if we start at the ankle, and I'm saying I need ankle dorsiflexion just to function every day. Kind of walk upstairs, to squat down. If I don't have adequate dorsiflexion to do that, but I still have to complete the task, I got to get the range somewhere. And so what we do, we go up to the next joint. Okay, I'm going to get it from my knee. I'm going to pop that knee in. But the knee's not supposed to function that way. We want to control our knee. That's our key features. We want the knee, the foot, and the hip in line. Okay, so we start sacrificing that good stuff. We drop the knee in because we lack ankle dorsiflexion. Okay, same thing with the hip. So we need hip mobility. We got to be able to squat down. If I don't have hip mobility, so say if my hamstrings are tight or something's going on, I go to lift something up, I round my back. Because I can't, I need the range of motion somewhere. I don't have it in my hips, I'm going to get it at the next joint. So instead of being here in that good position and actually using my hip flexion, I'm getting flexion from my back. Okay, so again, we steal it from the next joint up. We can see the same, Ian.
Does it have to be the next joint up, or can it be the joint on either side?
On either side. On either side. It doesn't have to always go up. Okay, we have to steal it from somewhere. Okay, if we need X amount of range to actually complete the task, and we can't get it with this joint, we got to go somewhere to get it. And so we can see the same thing with the shoulder. Okay, if the shoulder just doesn't have the range, I'm going to steal it from the scapula or the back. If I got to get my arm above my head, I'm going to have to get the range somewhere. Okay, so we go back to this guy here. If I'm trying to, say we're using a movement screen or something like the overhead squat to rule out a mobility issue. Okay, not ruling in, because it's an active test. We're trying to rule it out. So if we can have somebody squat like this, I can say ankles are good, hips are good, shoulders are good. Okay? But in order to do that, based on what we just talked about with this guy here, whoops, what I want to see, you have to show me that you have this ankle dorsiflexion. So knee's got to go past your toe, but you can't drop your knee in to do it. So I don't want to be stealing that range of motion by dropping my knee in. Okay, so if your knee's past your toe, and your knee's, so my knee's past my toe this way, but I'm dropping that knee in, maybe I'm doing it to get around the ankle restriction I have. So if I'm trying to use something like an overhead squat to rule out an ankle dorsiflexion issue, my knee's also got to be in line with my hip and my foot. If I'm trying to rule out a hip flexion mobility issue, so if we take the test you guys did earlier, that active straight leg raise, okay? The reason why we say your back has to be straight is because if you can get your leg all the way up, but you're rounding your back in the process, you're stealing that range from your back. So it's not a true measure of your hip flexion mobility. So if we're using the overhead squat to do the same thing, because it's also an active test, if I'm saying you have to get below parallel, and your thighs are there, but your back is rounded, I can't say yet that your hip flexion mobility is good, because you may have stolen that range from your back. Does that make sense? So if I'm saying I want to rule it out, well, you got to get to parallel, but your back's got to be straight in the process. So if we're using an active test like this to rule out somebody of having a mobility problem or some type of restriction, there is going to be this range of motion criteria. So your knees got to be past your toes, you got to be parallel, maybe your hands got to be back, but you have to show me that you can control the adjacent joint. Okay, your knees got to be good, your back has to be good, your shoulders got to be in a good position. You can't be way up here. And so if you do show me that, if the adjacent joint is in a good position, and you're showing me that you can go through this range, now I can say with some certainty that you actually have that mobility. Mobility is not your issue. Do something else. So, with all that, what I'm going to propose to you guys, and so we keep it very simple for our firefighters, is, and this is what we'll kind of do with each other, I want to be able to categorize you guys, and I want you guys to be able to categorize your PFTs into one of 3 bins. Okay, one of 3 bins. The first bin is the individual that doesn't have mobility. Okay, they have some type of restriction. So we tested them passively, and they don't have it. Okay, that person needs to work on mobility. My reason to categorize them into one of these 3 bins is because each bin requires a different intervention. So if we can categorize them, that informs us to say, okay, you need this work. Category 2, you need this work. Okay, so the first bin is we couldn't complete the passive test. So if I lied you guys down doing the straight leg raise and it was me taking you through it, and you got a 1, you need to work on the mobility. Okay, so that's the category over here. So their task, we got to increase range of motion. We got to give them more range. Second category is I had you do this overhead squat, and you look like this. Okay, that's what you look like. I'm like, something's going on. Is it your mobility? So I lied you down, I tested you passively. You're amazing. You're great. You have passive mobility, you can't use it. For some reason or another, you're not able to control yourself. You're not able to show me that you have active range of motion. Okay? That's individual here. So if we assess that individual, so we have them squat like this, we said, your hamstrings are tight. You need more ankle dorsiflexion. And we start giving them those solutions. They don't need it. They have lots of mobility. They need to learn how to move. Okay, so the individual in the middle has passive mobility, but they can't use it. Actively, mobility is not there. And then the third individual, we have them do a squat, rock bottom right away, everything's perfect. They have active mobility, they're able to use it, we don't even need to test them passively. So that individual, we got to build them up, we got to build their capacity a little bit. Or we're going to follow up with some other assessments to see where they do fall apart. But we can use an active test, or the combination of active and passive test, to categorize our firefighters in one of these 3 bins. We can say, you need mobility work because you don't have passive mobility. You need to learn how to move or how to control adjacent joints because you got the mobility. You're not using or integrating into the activities that are actually important to you. Or you're good. We got to follow up, do some additional stuff. You guys see that? What was category 1? We go far side there. What's that category? What's that? No control, no mobility. Okay? If you don't have mobility, you can't control it. Okay, so if I don't have the mobility in my shoulder, there's no way I can complete that task and actually control it. So that category, no mobility, no control. What's the middle one? Mobility, no control. And what's this one? Perfect. Okay, those are the 3 categories. So at the end of all this, so I'm going to have Luke and Alex come up, help me. We're going to walk through a screen that we can use with ourselves, with our firefighters, to put them into one of those 3 bins. With the goal of trying to inform the decisions that we make for exercise or for training. What do you actually need? Okay? Awesome. All right. So there are a couple posters you guys can use as a reference, but we'll walk you through each step of this test. What I'm going to ask you guys to do, so if you guys want to come up.